Hey everyone, it's Allie, and with the upcoming 1.1 season of Last Epoch, Harbingers of Ruin being only a week away, EHD has released a quality of life post that also has a sneak preview as some of the balance changes that will be coming in the next season. And what I wanted to do was to look at these skill and class changes and give you my opinion on them, as well as get you prepared for what we can expect in the patch notes. I need to remind you, this is not going to be the full patch notes, it's only a sneak preview at it, and I'm hoping that the patch notes are only a few days away at this point. Before we go any further, I do want to say I'm really sick and I've completely lost my voice. So I'm sorry if I sound a little bit raspy, but being a little bit sick is not going to stop me from reporting on important news. So with all that said, let's get into it and let's see what we can expect for the class balance in the next season. The first thing to mention here is going to be a major rework for channeling skills. In the past however long of Last Epoch's existence, channeling skills have never really been that meta and haven't really been that good outside of Warpath. A major thing holding back channeling skills was the fact that as you're channeling, your mana regeneration is completely disabled. This meant that you can never infinitely channel any channeling skill, and if you wanted to, for example, have some sort of proc that happened while you're channeling that costed mana, you would very quickly run out of mana, forcing you to then sit there and wait for your mana to go back up before you can keep channeling your skill. What is going to be happening with 1.1 is a major rework of that. You're now going to be able to regenerate mana during your channeling skill, making it so you can effectively infinitely channel all channeling skills in the game by investing into mana regeneration. One thing to mention here is that all channeling skills are gaining 8 mana added to their channeling cost, as that is going to make up for the fact that you have 8 base mana regeneration, and that's simply just in place to balance channeling skills to not make them too easy to utilize. If we want to look at Disintegrate, for example, Disintegrate was costing 7 mana to channel previously, but it is now going to cost 15 mana instead. 8 of that is going to be covered by your mana regeneration rate, meaning you have to deal with 7 mana drain per second. This means if you were to invest into 2 or 3 mana regeneration nodes on your gear, you should be able to hit 15 mana regeneration fairly easily, meaning that Disintegrate is now permanently free. Channeling skills in Last Epoch have basically not been usable for forever, and this change alone makes almost every single channeling skill suddenly go from unusable to suddenly being a pretty interesting thing to consider as an addition for whatever build or class you want to play. I can very well expect some channeling skills to pop up in the meta over the next few seasons and not just be all dead skills. We are also getting some skill reworks for the next season, which are honestly looking pretty exciting. The first one on the board is going to be Disintegrate. Now, Disintegrate previously had a pretty unhealthy interaction with 2 specific items that every single Disintegrate build relied on. Ingvar's Head used to give you 1% more damage per 1% critical strike chance that you had, and Gambler's Fallacy made you so you would always be at 100% critical strike chance until you have crit. Well, because Disintegrate did dot damage and it could never crit, that means your Gambler's Fallacy was always active, meaning your Ingvar's Head always doubled your damage. All Disintegrate builds heavily relied on this interaction to be viable, and what they're going to do is completely kill this interaction while at the same time buffing the base skill itself. It's now going to go from 15 to 24 base damage, as well as go from 300 effective divide damage to 480. This by itself is going to make it a pretty strong leveling skill, as this increased damage is very high for the first few early levels of the campaign. And for the end game, this is a pretty massive buff for the skill, given that they now have an amulet slot and an offhand slot that they can actually utilize rather than it specifically being tied by 2 specific uniques, giving them the double damage interaction. Now, as for the rest of Disintegrate, it is also getting a full tree rework. They have teased the rework on Twitter, showing us the full skill tree, but we will not know all the passive points until we see the patch notes. They have showcased us some of the new nodes themselves, and honestly, there is one in specific that I am very much looking forward to, and that is going to be Hyperfocal. Hyperfocal is going to make it so you gain 1% more lightning damage per 8 maximum mana. In a typical mana stacking Sorc setup, you can expect to get yourself somewhere around 1,800 mana in a mid-game setup, meaning that you will get around 225% more lightning damage with Disintegrate. The nice thing about Hyperfocal is that it's very close to start, meaning that this will most likely be one of the best ways to level a Sorcerer moving forward. Previously, you kind of only had Glacier and Static Orb as your 2 best skills, and even if you aren't interested in playing this as a endgame setup, mana stacking Disintegrate should be a very solid way to level your characters, as well as it being a very interesting way to ramp your damage in late game, making for another really fun build archetype. I really like when builds have some sort of innate scaling like this that allow you to just hyper focus on one specific stat, and I am personally going to be really excited to attempt to play a build with this and to attempt to make a Hyperfocal Disintegrate build meta. Moving on next, we have Shield Bash. Now, Shield Bash is also going to get a mini rework. We do not know if it's going to be a full skill tree rework, like we are getting for Disintegrate, but we will have to see what's going to happen in the patch notes. Typically, Shield Bash has only been used for the left side of the tree, which gave you a large amount of additional critical strike chance on your next attack, which is very popular to utilize as a buffer for Judgment builds. They are now attempting to also take Shield Bash and give it some pretty major damage increases to make it usable as an actual DPS skill. First off, Fury of Blows is being reworked to where it only costs you 9 mana to remove the cooldown off of Shield Bash, meaning it will be a lot easier to actually sustain its mana costs, while at the same time it gaining Indomitable Force, which is going to give it 2 added damage per block effectiveness, and Shield Storm, which is going to give it up to 50% increased attack speed. We don't know the full skill tree rework, but we do know that Shield Bash is going to get a very large amount of increased DPS on it, potentially make it very viable as an endgame build for Sentinels. Lastly, for the skill reworks, we have Avalanche, and this skill is going to be just cracked. Avalanche is no longer going to be a channeling skill, and instead it's going to be a normal cast, which is going to make you summon 1 large boulder followed by 10 smaller boulders. The larger boulder is going to have double AoE and double damage. If you were to combine all of the boulders together, the maximum effectiveness of add damage of Avalanche is now 4,800%. This is going to make this skill do a cracked amount of damage, and I can very easily see Avalanche being one of the highest DPS skills in the game. You might look at it and say Allie isn't the 42 mana cost a little bit bad, which yes, it's very high, meaning you'll have to invest into mana regeneration, but Avalanche also gains a lot of reduced mana cost on the base skill tree itself, meaning it shouldn't be too difficult to upkeep, and given just how much damage it's going to do, the mana cost of it is fully justified. Now, obviously, that 4,800% effectiveness of add damage is going to be ideal, as these smaller boulders are going to hit in a random spread around the big boulder. But the interesting thing about Avalanche is that increased AoE is only going to make the boulders bigger and not the radius in which they spread around the big boulder. This means with enough AoE and with a boss's hitbox being big enough, you will always be able to land every single one of the smaller boulders, giving you an insane amount of damage potential. The other node that I'm really interested here with Avalanche that they showcase was Alpine Guide, which is going to make it so you gain a smaller boulder when you crit with a big boulder, as well as you gaining a very large amount of base crit chance, meaning this should give you another guaranteed small boulder at 100% crit chance, raising the effectiveness of add damage of the skill upwards into 5,000%. The other really cool way you could build Avalanche in the future is with Stormcaller, which is going to give you a 45% chance at max points of gaining a storm stack per boulder hit that you do. This means you're going to get somewhere around 4.5 storm stacks per second from this, and because you can stack multiple avalanches on itself, this means you're going to get a lot of storm stacks for Storm Strike, which is going to be a really interesting way to rebuild that skill as a duo skill with Avalanche rather than a hybrid melee skill that was before. Let's move on to the passive reworks. So there are going to be 3 mid-scope passive tree changes for Sorcerer, Forge Guard, and Shaman. I'm going to discuss every single one of these in further detail in a separate video, as there's honestly quite a lot to talk about here, and I don't want this video to be a 30-minute long video, but we're going to briefly go over everything so you know exactly what you can expect. Now, these are not going to be full passive tree reworks. Instead, what they're doing is they're adding a bunch of additional threshold points to their trees, as these trees were honestly pretty lacking and didn't really have either good points or many threshold skills to look for. Now, this is not going to be all the passive tree changes. They're most likely going to be a lot more changes in the patch notes, but this is a quick preview that they've given us. First off, for Sorcerer, we have 5 new points. Now, personally, I'm not really a fan of Arcane Current, and I don't really see the point of Arcane Current really existing in the game. They're mostly just going to gloss over it and move on to Archmage. Arcane Current is just going to give you a spark charge for every skill that you use that costs over 40 mana, which in my opinion is not very good, given that Sorc doesn't really have any sort of way of scaling spark charges, and you wouldn't really be able to generate enough spark charges to make Fragment the Enigma feel good with this. Don't really currently see where this is going to be good, but I'm sure somebody in the future will most likely find something where this becomes really strong. Moving on next to Archmage. Oh boy, this passive is going to break the game. Archmage used to previously give you 1 added spell damage per point, with it tripling if you hit a mana breakpoint. It is now going to instead give you 1 spell damage per point and a chance to refund 20% of a spell's mana cost. At 1,000 maximum mana, the values are tripled, which means the refund's just going to always happen, making all of your skills have 20% less mana cost. This is going to be crazy, and it's going to allow for some really silly builds, and I'm really looking forward to this in the future. This is honestly good enough to make Sorc into a meta class by itself. Sorc is also getting some much needed defensive layer increases through Mana Shell, giving you ward scaling based on your mana. Nice thing is at the start of the tree, so you'll be able to get yourself some ward sustain early on. And with the upcoming ward nerfs, which we'll talk about later, this is going to be even better than before, as ward per second is now the strongest ward stat in the game. You also get the same thing out of Mana Well, which is going to give you 50% of your mana spent gain as ward. So between these 2 points, you should have a pretty nice defensive layer. It should very nicely hold you over until you can stack more ward retention in the endgame. Lastly, we have Dragon's Breath, which I really like. Just 40% more AoE, lots of generic damage. This is really good, especially because this gives you variety on how you can put together your Sorcerer. And next, we have the Forge Guard. Now, Forge Guard had some much needed changes that had to happen to it, especially in its defensive layers. I don't personally think this went far enough for defenses, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. Shield Crafter has been reworked to where instead of it giving you Ring of Shields on hit, you now get it on block, meaning it's a lot more effective and you'll get more than one proc per map. And this is going to give you really high Ring of Shields uptime, which is a really nice defensive layer for Forge Guard. I really think Forge Guard needs more than this, but it's at least something. We then have Champion the Forge and Master of Arms. These two are going to go really well together for whatever two-handed build you want to play on Forge Guard. Champion the Forge is going to give you 1% crit multi per 2 strength, and you can very easily hit 150 strength on a Forge Guard, meaning this is just 75% crit multi. When you pair it with the crit chance of Champion of the Forge itself, be a really good node for pretty much every single build. And then Master of Arms is going to give you another 18 additional raw strength if you have a two-handed weapon equipped. This together is going to be a really strong combo, and we can see Forge Guard's base damage going up by quite a decent amount with just these 2 nodes alone. I really like that's going to benefit you if you are dual wielding as well by giving you a lot of attack speed and some parry chance, which makes up for the downside of dual wielding, being that you are going to take more damage. But I don't really like the shield nodes on this, as the frailty chance and the reduced damage taken from crits are stats you can very easily get somewhere else. I'd rather not waste 8 passive points on it. Then we also have Hammer and Anvil, which has gotten a massive rework. The old Hammer and Anvil was the most useless point in the game, make you take more damage but make you do more damage. It was just bad, and you would never honestly want to take 25% more damage. It just was not worth your time. And now it's just becoming an armor shred node for both you and your minions, as well as giving you a very large attack speed steroid for your minions when you use a 20 mana skill. This is going to be really good with Forge Strike, as Forge Strike is a 20 mana skill, and it's going to boost your minions attack speed and your armor shred, making this a pretty big buff for Forge Strike. Finally, you have Javelineer, which is going to give you throwing crit chance per dex, meaning that it's going to make you want to play a crit based shield throw or hammer throw build. Shield throw has some really nice crit scaling on it already, so this plus shield throw should go hand in hand pretty well. Then we finally have Shaman, and my god, did Shaman get a glow up. Shaman had some of the worst nodes in the game, somehow worse than Forge Guard, as some of them gave you very little stats, and well, the new ones give you a lot more useful stats. First, we have Swirling Maelstrom, which is now going to give you 20 endurance threshold per Maelstrom. That is a really big defensive buff for Shaman, as endurance stacking is one of the best ways to stay alive on a life-based build. And typically, if you are going to invest into Maelstrom, you're looking to get about 10 stacks of Maelstorms at a minimum, which means at a minimum, this is 200 additional flat endurance threshold, which is quite a lot, as flat endurance threshold is pretty hard to get your hand on. A nice thing about this is that if you're going to invest into Maelstorms, you also get other benefits from it, such as increased dodge rating per stack, haste, frenzy, and a bunch of chill chance, making this actually really good to invest in as just a general way of making your Shaman a lot better. Shattered Heavens was literally the worst point in the game, giving you a solid 2 added damage per point and nothing else. They massively glowed up this passive point by giving it increased minion damage, 20% frostbite chance per point, which is a lot, and some minion frostbite chance on top of it. This is a hell of a lot better than it was before, and I'm really happy with what they did for this node. The same can be said true for Avatar Thunder, where it only gave you and your minions 2 flat lightning damage per point. It's now going to also give you some lightning penetration per attunement, which is a really big DPS increase for something like Storm Totem. This is a no-brainer take, and it's just a big DPS increase overall, making it a really strong node. Gift Disguise is now going to also give you Frenzy for your totems, making it a pretty nice upgrade as well. And finally, Iron Bark is going to be a massive buff for any sort of Shadowlands build, just due to the fact that this is going to give you a lot of flat regen, which is a stat that's very difficult to get. For Shadowlands builds, the way you scale them is by getting as much total regeneration rate as possible, which is going to then give you melee cold damage. And the hardest stat to get here is specifically flat health regen. We have a lot of sources of percent health regen, with very little flat health regen all over the place. In the case of a attunement stacking Shadowlands setup, that means 100 attunement is going to give you 33 additional flat health regen, and with all the percent health regen you are you're having in that build, this means you're going to gain probably somewhere around 400 to 500 additional health regen for Shattered Lance, which is quite a big DPS increase. I really think this might bring Shattered Lance builds not necessarily into meta, but definitely up a tier or two in terms of how good the builds are, and you definitely expect a few of them to pop up this season as well. Finally, the last thing to talk about here is going to be the Ward rework. So Ward, as we all know, in season 1.0 was just a little bit silly. And well, the devs have acknowledged this and they are nerfing the ward decay rate to make it from it being a linear scale to an exponential scale. The TLDR of this is that under 4,000 ward, you are actually going to overall have more ward and your build is going to be buffed. From 4,000 to 10,000 ward, you're going to be slightly nerfed to where you're going to have a little bit less ward, but it's not anything major. And then from 10,000 ward and above, you are going to have less and less and less and less ward than what you previously had. This means that you can't have 30, 40, 50,000 ward anymore without an unbelievably high amount of investment that is most likely not possible. With the current numbers that we have in game, pretty much anything above 15,000 ward is effectively impossible at this point, but we can assume that at some point in the future, we will probably have something that will still hit 20, 30, 40,000 ward. This is not as big of a nerf as people think it is. For a build that has somewhere around 12,000 ward or so, you're most likely going to go down to 9,000 ward, which is a pretty decent chunk of your EHP, but you still have overall more EHP than most other builds still do. It's going to be completely fine, and ward is still going to be a viable endgame way to keep yourself alive. It's most likely still going to be the most powerful one in the game. It's just going to be knocked down a peg or two, which is, in my opinion, completely fine. And if you want to play around with how much ward you now have, Chunk Labs has a very nice calculator on it where you can put in all of your stats, and it has a button for the 1.0 scaling and the 1.1 scaling, allowing you to see how much ward you can currently have in your build. This will be linked in the description below if you want to play around with it, and hopefully this will show you that if you weren't stacking an atrocious amount of ward where you were basically breaking the game, it really did not matter, and even if you were, you still have a lot of ward. If you have any questions on any of this, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below and I'd be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. I also stream on Twitch every single day, so feel free to come to my Twitch and ask any of your questions there. I will be streaming every single day leading up to the launch of the game, and I am looking forward to taking all these changes and putting them together into new builds. Personally, I'm really excited for a mana stacking and meteor build. That's going to most likely be my league starter for this season if testing for it ends up going well. With all that said, Kitties, I hope you join me for 1.1. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all in the next one.